I don't want to scare you with gory images, but I mean it when I tell you that the brain can actually be physically impaired if it has to sustain high levels of stress and the stress hormone cortisol for long enough periods of time. There's just no getting around that. Stress can quite literally change the brain for the worse. What do I mean by that? Well, if stress and cortisol levels are high enough for long enough, extremely important parts of the brain begin to shrink, while other parts actually expand. So here, as you look at this image, you can see neurons shrinking in the hippocampus, which is the most important region of the brain when it comes to your ability to learn and remember what you've learned. As you can see here, when it has to sustain very high levels of stress and when it's bombarded with stress hormones, like cortisol being the primary one, it starts to shut down. The same thing happens in another extremely important region called the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that's the most newly evolved. It's the part of the brain that maybe you've heard continues to develop throughout adolescence and even into the early 20s. Now, this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, has many different jobs that are incredibly important for you, all of which are in support of what we call higher level cognition and also higher level emotion. So your ability to regulate your emotions, to regulate yourself, to have cognitive control over your ideas, to make good decisions. And importantly, there's a part of this prefrontal cortical region called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is actually just behind your eyes and your forehead. One of its major roles is to put a brake on the amygdala. The amygdala is a bilateral structure whose job is to support emotions, especially negative emotions like fear and anxiety and anger. So it is a primitive part of the brain. I mean, even lizards have amygdalas, but what reptiles and other, quote, lower species don't have are these massive prefrontal cortices that allow them to put a brake on the amygdala and to exert down regulatory control over these lower level systems that evolved a long time ago. Now, I'm not trying to disparage these regions. The amygdala is very important for your ability to make decisions. You don't want to suppress it entirely, but what you do want to do is keep it under control, because if it takes the reins, that's when you really feel out of control because you're losing emotion regulation abilities and cognitive control over the thoughts you have, emotional control over the feelings you have, and behavioral control over the output. Like you yell at the wrong person, or you have a breakdown, you burst into tears, something that wouldn't happen to you if your brain regions that were so important for cognitive control weren't saturated with stress hormones. When I say it gets worse, though, that is because the amygdala starts to grow. So the more stress you're under, and the longer the period of time your body's secreting a lot of cortisol and other stress-related neuromodulators like norepinephrine, which is the brain component of epinephrine or adrenaline, the more and more and more of this you secrete, the more the amygdala actually grows. So your brain is preparing for threat. It's trying to protect you. But what happens is it's wiring you up for these negative emotions. And the more dominance the amygdala has over the brain, over the neural system that you bring to school with you every day, the more likely you are to have inappropriate emotions and affect and a lack of cognitive control. So it's much harder to feel empathy. It's much harder to build trust. It's much harder to have the positive emotions that allow the types of social contagion through groups that we know are so beneficial. It's easier to snap at somebody. It's easier to be angry. It's easier to be anxious. And in fact, when you're in a high stress brain state for long enough, it is no wonder that that puts you at risk for conditions like depression, clinical depression, and also different forms of anxiety disorders, because the brain starts to wire up in a way that is self-perpetuating. So that is the thing to understand when it comes to what happens to the brain when you're under high levels of stress. Stress really does get under the skin. We talk about stress like it's this murky, hypothetical, psychological concept, and oh, we're all under stress. Why should we take it seriously? Well, it's because it can quite literally change the brain in a way that makes you much more negatively emotional and much more impulsive, and that is not what you need at school or at home.